Everyone told me the country was quiet. But that morning, I realized quiet doesn't always mean peace. The porch screen door groaned on its hinges as I stepped out, coffee steaming in my hand, the distant hum of cicadas clinging to the last breath of summer. 47 acres of farmland stretched around me, dew glistening on the grass, the cottonwood grove standing tall against a pale dawn sky. This land was my inheritance, my anchor. For most folks in Wilton Ridge, it was just a forgotten patch of earth behind the hills, rusted tractors, a leaning red barn, and a dog named Lucky pacing beside me. But for me, it was the only place in the world that felt like home. I'd spent years away. Too many years wearing a badge, driving across sunburnt ranges, and enforcing federal land laws as a Bureau of Land Management officer. I'd seen standoffs and disputes, watched neighbors turn on neighbors over a strip of fence or a dry creek bed. And when I finally came back to this farm, after my mother's funeral, I thought I'd left all that behind. "Don't let them pave it over, Ben," she'd whispered to me before she passed. "This land raised generations. I promised her I wouldn't, and I meant it." For the first few months, life was almost cinematic in its stillness. I woke with the sun, mended the old fence lines, cleared brush, and planted cover crops in the wide, forgiving soil. At night, Lucky would curl up at my feet as I sipped whiskey on the porch, letting the wind roll across the fields. Out here, I wasn't an officer or a negotiator or a man carrying the weight of other people's fights. I was just Ben. Then one morning, the silence felt wrong. I noticed a man pacing along my fence line with a clipboard. He didn't wave. Didn't answer when I called out, just measured, scribbled something down, and drove off. I thought maybe it was a county worker. Maybe a survey for power lines. But a few days later, a row of bright orange flags appeared along the western edge of my land, right by the cottonwoods that shaded the dry creek bed. Little plastic sentinels in the wind, marking a path I hadn't given anyone permission to walk. I yanked them out one by one, tossed them into a rusted bucket, and tried to laugh it off. The next week, twice as many flags were back. Then the drone came. It hovered over my pasture for 10 long minutes, a mechanical vulture watching my every move. Lucky barked himself hoarse at it, but the drone didn't flinch. When it finally buzzed away into the clouds, the old dread I'd left behind in my BLM days crept back into my chest. Something was coming. I could feel it. 3 days later, I found a letter stuffed in my mailbox with no stamp, no return address. "Dear resident," it began, "Wilton Ridge HOA is pleased to announce the planning phase of a luxury condominium development to enhance community value. Preliminary surveys have begun. Your cooperation is appreciated. Luxury condominiums. On my farmland." I read it 3 times before the words sank in. They weren't asking permission. They were telling me. I wasn't even a member of the HOA. My land was zoned agricultural decades before their neatly trimmed cul-de-sacs existed. And yet they were moving as if my farm already belonged to them. The next morning, I drove into the heart of Wilton Ridge to the HOA office, a spotless brick building that looked more like a dentist's lobby than a neighborhood office. Inside, a receptionist with thin glasses eyed me like I was a mechanic who'd taken a wrong turn. When I asked to see the president, a woman finally emerged. Perfect hair, thin lips, clipboard in hand. Her name was Deborah Marks. She smiled the kind of smile people reserve for children who don't know better. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "we've been meaning to speak with you." "Then maybe," I said, voice tight, "you should have knocked." "On my door instead of surveying my fields?" She didn't flinch. "It's all part of the neighborhood enhancement plan. The community voted to expand our housing options." I stared at her. "I'm not part of your community." She blinked, then flipped through her clipboard as if it were a script. "We were advised by a consultant that your plot falls within the extended boundary. The land hasn't been actively farmed in years, which suggests abandonment." The laugh that slipped out of me was sharp and bitter. "That's not how property law works. And if you think I don't know the law—" "Oh, we have legal counsel," she said, her eyebrows arched in the smug way people get when they think the game is already over. I didn't argue. Not because she was right, but but because I recognized the look in her eyes. I'd seen it in oil company executives, in land speculators, in every entitled person who thought rural meant uneducated and unprotected. This was a land grab. I drove home, in silence, past the open pastures and wind-worn barns, thinking of my mother's voice. Don't let them pave it over. That night, I couldn't sleep. I dug out the old fireproof cabinet and pulled the file my grandfather started in 1957, the original land grant, federal easements, zoning records, and tax history proving continuous use. I printed copies of everything, scanned and backed them up. Then I called an old friend from my BLM days. Terry, I said, do me a favor. Keep an eye out for any permit filings under Wilton Ridge. Should I flag it with the state? He asked. Not yet, I said, though my gut already knew the truth. They weren't bluffing. The first backhoe showed up a week later. I didn't stop them. Not yet. Because I wanted them to cross the line. Because once they did, once they put steel in my soil, everything would change. The next morning, before the sun rose, I walked the western edge of my property. Dew clung to the tall grass. Lucky trotted at my side, ears twitching in the cool air. Plastic flags fluttered in the wind, a line of bright scars across the earth. They hadn't even bothered to hide them this time. I crouched down, yanked one from the soil, and turned it in my hand. Coordinates, survey codes, WRD, Wilton Ridge Development. My stomach clenched. When I looked up, a white SUV idled just beyond my gate. A man in slacks and a collared shirt stood by the bumper, arms crossed, watching me like he owned the horizon. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. I knew that type. The ones who showed up on federal rangeland pretending not to understand the boundary. Always stretching, always testing. That night, I stood on my porch, badge in hand for the first time in years. The metal was cold, heavy. I wasn't on duty anymore. But that didn't mean I'd forgotten who I was. I was Benjamin Coleman. And this land wasn't going anywhere. I woke to the sound of engines, low mechanical groans that didn't belong to this land. Lucky was already at the door, growling in short, sharp bursts. When I stepped onto the porch, the morning air smelled like wet soil and diesel. And there they were, 3 bulldozers, lined up at the edge of my pasture like predators testing the boundary of their prey. Their metal treads glistened with dew, their exhaust whispering into the pale dawn. Behind them, 3 men in safety. Vests stood on the rise, clipboards in hand. They didn't look at the land the way I did. They looked at it like numbers on a spreadsheet, like square footage waiting to be claimed. I walked down the slope slowly, boots sinking into the damp earth, every step leaving a print. Lucky stayed at my heel, tail stiff, ears pinned back. Morning, I said, my voice flat as the valley. The tallest man turned, sunglasses reflecting the sunrise even though the light was still soft. Hey there, he said, casual, like we were neighbors discussing lawn care. This is private property, I said, pointing at the soil beneath their boots. You're trespassing. Turn those machines around. He barely looked at me. We're operating under directive from Wilton Ridge HOA. Development starts this week. Your area was annexed. I laughed once, bitter and sharp. I didn't sign anything. I wasn't notified, and your map is wrong. Now he did look at me. Sir, I'm not paid to debate property law. We have permits. If you interfere, you'll be the one trespassing on an active construction site. It was a bait and switch, the same game I'd seen before. Bureaucrats and contractors love to bet on your fear. They spoke with confidence, betting that you didn't know the law well enough to push back. I took a long breath. You're building on land you don't own. 1 more inch forward, and this becomes a federal issue. They chuckled. What? You got a cousin in code enforcement? I stared him down for a long beat, then said slow and cold, No, but I do have jurisdiction. I turned and walked away. My back tingled, waiting for someone to yell or follow. But they didn't. Not yet. Back inside, I pulled out the old folder I hadn't opened in years. Inside was my lifeline, the 1963 Federal Zoning Easement, the Bureau of Land Management Soil Classification Maps. The legacy agreement my grandfather signed, granting BLM oversight for 99 years on any land use conversion. It was ironclad, and for the first time in months, I wasn't just a farmer. I was the man I used to be, the one who could shut down an illegal operation with a single form and a badge. I spent the next few hours drafting emails and filling out federal complaint forms. Environmental violation, unauthorized construction, on federally overseen agricultural property, zoning fraud investigation request. I wasn't bluffing anymore. By noon, a new problem rolled up my gravel drive. A man in tactical gear with a patch that said Wilton Ridge Enforcement stepped out of a black SUV, not county sheriff, not police, private security. He handed me a typed letter accusing me of obstructing community development and damaging HOA property. His hand hovered near his holster as he spoke. "You need to cease interference immediately," he said, "or legal action will follow." I didn't answer. I just raised my phone and snapped his picture, document and all. "You're trespassing," I said, "and impersonating law enforcement." He hesitated, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Then he left. That night, the field didn't sleep, and neither did I. I camped out by the southern tree line, hidden behind the old tractor shed, camera in hand, thermos of coffee steaming in the cold night air. Around 3 a.m., headlights cut through the darkness. 3 figures in dress clothes, not construction workers, walked the edge of my property with clipboards and lasers, whispering like thieves in a church. I filmed everything from 10 feet away, crouched in the shadows. Then I heard one of them mutter, "He doesn't know how far this goes." I smiled in the dark. "Oh, I know," I whispered to myself. "And you're about to find out." By sunrise, I'd backed up the footage onto 3 drives. One in my lockbox, one in my truck, one buried in a coffee can beneath the rosebush, by the porch. Years of federal work had taught me one rule. When people are willing to steal land in the dark, they're willing to do worse in the light. The next morning, 3 sharp knocks rattled my door. Not friendly. Not neighborly. When I opened it, there stood Deborah Marks, the HOA president, flanked by 2 men in blue blazers and khakis. Her lipstick was a shade I'd never seen on her before. Battle red. "Mr. Coleman," she said sweetly, "we need to discuss your recent interference." I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "We'd like to resolve this amicably," she said. "No." Her smile faltered. "Excuse me? I don't allow trespassers in my home." Her jaw tightened. One of the men stepped forward. "Mr. Coleman, we represent Wilton Ridge's Planning Advisory Subcommittee. This project has full endorsement at the municipal level." I held his gaze. "I'm not a member of your HOA, and your subcommittee is about as legal as a lemonade stand in a parking lot." Deborah's cheeks flushed. She thrust a manila envelope toward me. "This is a formal notice of annexation. Cease all obstruction, or face civil penalties." I didn't touch it. "Leave it on the porch." "You're making a mistake," she warned. I leaned in, just enough for her to feel the shift in air. "Ma'am, I've mediated land disputes in Utah more civilized than this HOA circus. You're lucky all I've done is film you." Her eyes flickered. For the first time, she didn't look so sure of herself. By evening, the quiet country road outside my farm wasn't quiet anymore. HOA volunteers swarmed my fence line like ants on a fallen branch. They hammered in signs: future site of Ridgeview Terrace, a Wilton Ridge community expansion. They hung banners across my fencing, blocking my view of the field I'd bled for. Pink and blue flags sprouted across my land like it was some twisted gender reveal for a crime. Joggers passed by, pausing to take photos. A few clapped. Others just shook their heads, unsure who the villain was. I took pictures of everything. That night, I called Terry. "They're escalating," I said. "I saw that annexation notice," he replied. "Sloppy, legally worthless, but it could stall the county response long enough for them to pour concrete. So what do I do?" "You stop the pour. Once the foundation goes down, it's a whole different battle. And Ben?" His voice lowered. "Time to flash the badge." I stared at the leather case in my drawer that night, the badge heavy and polished inside. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Don't let them pave it over. The war had begun. The next morning, I woke before the sun, not to birdsong, to the low hum of engines. When I stepped onto the porch, Lucky at my heel, the air carried the scent of damp soil mixed with something metallic and final. The bulldozers had returned. Not one, not three. 5 of them this time crouched at the edge of my pasture like steel beasts, engines idling in the fog. Behind them stood a convoy of trucks, concrete mixers, supply vans, and pickups with the Southside Development Group logo stamped on their doors. And watching it all, leaning against a white SUV with a coffee in hand, was Deborah Marks. Her lipstick was still red. Her smile wasn't. I walked down the hill with purpose, boots pressing wet grass flat, each step heavier than the last. Lucky followed, low growls rumbling from his chest. I didn't shout. I didn't wave. I just walked until my boots hit the dirt road at the edge of my land, and the nearest foreman finally noticed me. "Morning," I said, voice flat. He gave me a look like I was a kid interrupting grown-up business. "You again?" he said. "Look, we're on a deadline. You can't be here." I didn't blink. "You're standing on my land." He chuckled. "Sir, Wilton Ridge HOA signed off. We got the permits. Maybe check with your neighbors before you start screaming." Theft. I took one slow step forward. "I'm not screaming," I said, "but I will if you take one more inch." Behind him, a bulldozer lurched forward a foot and stopped, just enough to make a point. The man smirked. "Look, we're not here to fight. We're here to build. And if you've got a complaint, file it with the HOA. Otherwise," I reached into my vest pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out the badge. The small gold emblem caught the early light. Federal issue, Bureau of Land Management. My old life, shining like a blade. The man froze. Behind him, one of the younger crewmen muttered, boss?" I held the badge in the air, not high, just enough for them to see. "You are trespassing." "On federally protected agricultural land," I said, voice steady. "Your so-called permits are under review. Your activity here is now a federal matter. If you move another yard of soil, it will be a crime." The foreman's smirk died on his lips. "Federal? This is private." "Not anymore," I interrupted. "Your HOA forged documents. Your developer filed fraudulent maps. And if you want to test how serious this is, go ahead. Move that bulldozer 1 more inch. I'll call the U.S. Marshal before your treads hit the next clump of grass." Silence. Just engines idling and a dog growling. The foreman stepped back. Deborah's SUV door creaked open behind him. She emerged slowly, heels clicking on gravel, lips tight. "Mr. Coleman," she called. "This display is unnecessary. You're scaring my contractors." "Good," I said, my voice calm but heavy. "They should be scared. So should you." She crossed her arms. "You can't stop progress with a badge you don't even wear anymore. You're a retiree waving. Memories." I took a step toward her. "Maybe, but I still know the law better than you. And I know this. Once you pour concrete, it's permanent. That makes this criminal trespass an environmental fraud." Her face twitched. She didn't like that I knew the game she was playing. Let the silence hang, then tucked the badge back into my pocket. "You've got until sundown to get your equipment off my land. After that, you're in violation of Federal Code 43 CFR 1610.53b. Look it up." I turned my back on her. Slowly, deliberately. Walking away from someone like Deborah was a different kind of battle tactic. It told her I wasn't afraid. By noon, the machines were gone. But I knew it wasn't victory. It was just a shift in strategy. Sure enough, that evening, a black sedan rolled past my gate and stopped. 2 men in suits stepped out. One had a leather briefcase. The other carried a single folder. I met them at the porch steps. "Mr. Coleman," the taller one said, voice smooth as oil. "I'm Patrick Ree, counsel for Wilton Ridge Homeowners Association. We're here to offer you a solution." I didn't move. Lucky stayed by my leg, stiff and alert. The shorter man opened the folder and slid a paper forward like it was a magic trick. "A formal buyout," Ree said. "Full market value for your land plus 50% above assessed value. Cash settlement. Today. I glanced at the paper, then at him. Then I laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh that cuts. You tried to steal it, I said. Then you forged papers, sent fake cops, bulldozed my crops. And now you think you can buy me out like I'm some desperate farmer with overdue bills? Mr. Coleman, Ree said softly, you've made this personal. It doesn't have to be. I stepped down off the porch and into his space. Slowly. You're right, I said. It doesn't have to be personal, but it is. And I don't sell to thieves. The man with the folder swallowed hard. Ree's jaw tightened. Then I pulled out the badge again, holding it right at eye level. Tell Deborah, I said, that the next knock on her office door won't be mine. It'll be federal. I watched the color drain from the shorter man's face. They left without another word. That night, the quiet was heavier than usual. I sat on the porch, whiskey glass in hand. Lucky curled at my feet, the badge glinting under the porch light. I'd drawn my line in the dirt. The question now wasn't whether they'd cross it again. It was how, and how hard. Because people like Deborah Marks don't fold. They regroup, and they come back sharper, and I was ready. The storm didn't hit with thunder. It came in envelopes. 3 days after I sent Deborah Marks and her hired suits off my land, I found a thick manila envelope on my porch. No postage, no signature, just heavy enough to feel like trouble. Inside were photocopied pages, a notice of annexation, a community development plan, and worst of all, a deed with my name on it. Except it wasn't mine. My signature, crooked, jagged, sat at the bottom of a document I had never seen. According to that paper, I had transferred development rights to the Wilton Ridge Homeowners Association 6 months ago, in exchange for community equity and future condo revenue participation. It was a lie, a forgery. I stared at that page until my vision blurred. My hands shook so hard that the paper rattled like dry leaves. I'd seen scams before. I'd seen men try to pass off fake grazing permits or falsified mineral claims. But this was different. This was personal. This was someone trying to erase 3 generations of my family with a pen. Lucky nudged my leg, sensing the quake in my chest. Not this time, boy, I whispered. They picked the wrong man. By noon, I was in my truck, heading for Langston, the nearest county seat, the same place I'd walked into with my mother as a boy when she paid property taxes every spring. The courthouse was beige stucco with a sun-faded flag. The carpet inside smelled like coffee and dust. I went straight to the zoning department and asked for every file on my parcel, 31876B, Wilton Ridge Township. The secretary hesitated. You got written authorization? I'm the owner, I said, placing my license and a copy of my deed on the counter. 10 minutes later, she returned with a thick folder and a nervous look in her eyes. There's a lot here, she said quietly. Too much, actually. She buzzed me into the records room. I sat at a battered wooden table and opened the folder. Page 1, HOA Development Proposal. Page 2, a rezoning amendment from agricultural legacy to multi-use residential. Page 3, a sale agreement with my forged signature. By page 7, my stomach twisted into knots. They hadn't just filed one document. They'd filed an entire package of lies, forged signatures, notarized in another county with stamped approvals. From the local zoning board. Someone inside that office had either been bought or had been asleep at the wheel. The more I read, the colder my blood ran. This wasn't incompetence. This was fraud. I didn't knock when I walked into the zoning commissioner's office. Marvin Bright? I said, voice low but sharp. A man in his late 50s looked up from behind a desk stacked with folders. His shirt was pressed, his smile tight, and his certificate on the wall read, "Serving our county with pride." You approved a land transfer? With a forged signature, I said, dropping the folder onto his desk. He blinked. Excuse me? That's my land, that's my name, and that is not my signature. He hesitated, flipping through the pages. The color drained from his face on page 14. I thought this was part of a bulk adjustment submission, he muttered. The HOA filed several parcels at once, said everything had been cleared legally. You didn't check? My voice rose like a slow-building storm. We were backlogged. We trusted their legal team. I slammed my hand on the desk hard enough to make his pens jump. You signed off on theft, Marvin. That's not a clerical mistake. That's complicity. His lip trembled. I can fix this. You're damn right you can. You're going to freeze this permit today. Issue a stop work order. Mark it under federal review. And you're going to write a statement acknowledging potential document falsification. I have to talk to legal. You'll talk to me, I cut him off. Or I take this to the Inspector General and the press, and you can explain on camera how you let an HOA steal a man's land. We stared at each other for a long, heavy moment. Then, slowly, his hand reached for the phone. An hour later, I walked out of that building with a signed stop work order, copies of every fraudulent document, an internal memo stating the zoning board had been misled by incomplete and potentially falsified documentation. It wasn't victory yet, but it was ammo. I scanned everything to my cloud drive, sent copies to Terry, and titled the email, "Now we're in business." By the time I got home, the war had gone public. A brand new sign sat at the end of my road, condos. Coming soon. Pre-construction tours this weekend. I parked the truck, grabbed a hammer, and started my own campaign. I stapled the stop work order to every stake, every tree, every makeshift banner they'd hung on my fence. I nailed one to their shiny developer sign, right over the glossy rendering of fake smiling families and rooftop patios. Then, I climbed onto my old flatbed trailer, pulled out my phone, and hit record. The camera caught me standing in the wind, holding two things, my BLM badge and the county's stop work order. I spoke slow and steady. My name is Benjamin Coleman. I am the legal owner of this land. The Wilton Ridge HOA has forged documents, trespassed, and attempted to build on federally protected agricultural property. As of today, all construction is halted. Any further intrusion will be unlawful, and I will pursue every legal avenue until justice is done. This isn't just about property. It's about legacy, and I won't be silent. I posted the video everywhere. Facebook, HOA watchdog groups, a local news tip line. By nightfall, it had 10,000 views. By midnight, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Neighbors called, reporters emailed. Even a young woman from the State University's Environmental Science Department asked if she could bring students to document the damage. The quiet man on the edge of Wilton Ridge wasn't invisible anymore, and the HOA had just been dragged into the light. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid, but because adrenaline had moved into my blood like a tenant. I sat on the porch with Lucky at my feet, the badge heavy in my palm, staring out at the dark outline of the field. Somewhere beyond those, cottonwoods, I knew someone was watching, someone who thought the fight was over because they had paper and signatures. They didn't know me. I'd spent 20 years dealing with ranchers, developers, even armed standoffs. I didn't fold, and I wasn't folding now. The sun rose on a different world. My phone buzzed before I even poured my coffee. Notifications stacked like bricks. Texts, voicemails, emails. My video had caught fire. By 7 a.m., it had been shared by local news affiliates, HOA watchdog pages, and a Reddit thread titled, "Local HOA tries to steal farmland and meets the wrong neighbor." I scrolled through the comments, half stunned, half proud. Some cheered me on. Some shared their own HOA horror stories, petty fines, bullying, even threats of foreclosure. Others asked if they could camp in my field just to spite the board. But under all the noise, there was a steady drumbeat of something else. Attention. And attention, I knew, was a double-edged sword. By mid-morning, a black SUV crept down my gravel drive. 2 men in suits stepped out, followed by the third passenger I'd been expecting, Deborah Marks. Her lipstick was different today, redder, sharper. The kind of red that warned of a last stand. She didn't knock. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked up the porch steps like she still owned the ground under her heels. Mr. Coleman, she said, voice syrupy but strained. We've seen your video. I sipped my coffee. You'll be seeing a lot more soon. She gestured toward the fence where one of my stop work orders flapped in the breeze. I believe we can resolve this, she said, privately, before it becomes a public spectacle. I let the words hang in the air like smoke. Oh, it's already public. You made it that way when you built a road through my pasture without permission. Her jaw tightened. That was a misunderstanding. I laughed once, bitter and low. No, forgery is not a misunderstanding. It's a felony. The taller of the two men cleared his throat. Mr. Coleman, I'm Patrick Ree, legal counsel for Wilton Ridge HOA. There seems to have been an error in deed processing. We'd like to discuss a settlement. I stepped down from the porch slowly, boots grinding on the gravel. Don't gaslight me. You filed a forged deed to justify illegal construction. I have the proof. The county knows. The media is watching. And the feds are about to take a hard look at every permit you've ever touched. The shorter man's hands twitched against his briefcase. Ree's jaw worked like he was chewing on a lie he couldn't swallow. We are prepared, Ree said carefully, to offer a generous compensation package in exchange for a retraction and formal release of claim. Full market value plus damages. I stared at him, then I laughed. Not a friendly laugh. The kind that comes from disbelief, the kind that tastes like iron. You want to buy me off? I said. You think this is about money? Ree spread his hands. We're trying to resolve this peacefully. Peacefully? I cut him off. You bulldozed my field. You filed lies with the county. You sent fake cops to my door. And now you show up with a checkbook like that erases everything? Deborah's voice went cold. Be careful, Mr. Coleman. Pride can be expensive. I reached into my vest and pulled out the badge, holding it up at eye level. This isn't pride. This is protection. Benjamin Coleman, Bureau of Land Management. Retired but credentialed. I spent 20 years stopping land theft across 3 states. Do you really think your HOA bake sale budget is going to scare me? The red in her cheeks wasn't lipstick anymore. It was anger. You don't have to escalate this, she said, quieter now. You already did, I replied. Then I pointed down the driveway. Get off my land. They left, not quickly, not with words. Just the slow, sour retreat of people who had finally met a wall they couldn't push over. I didn't have long to savor the moment. By noon, Channel 4 News was parked in front of my barn. A young reporter named Carla Nguyen stepped out, microphone in hand, eyes scanning the tire ruts in my pasture. Mr. Coleman? She called. I nodded, and within minutes, she was walking the property with me, her cameraman filming every scar. The gravel access road cutting through my crops, the bright survey flags fluttering in the wind like a taunt, the eroded slope where the first bulldozer had chewed into the earth. This is what they did, I said into the camera. My voice was steady, but there was a weight behind every word. They thought they could erase 3 generations of history with forged paperwork and heavy machinery. They thought nobody would fight back. Why speak now? Carla asked. Why not before? I looked straight into the lens, because I thought I could handle it quietly. But they didn't just try to steal land. They tried to erase legacy. And I won't let that happen. That night, Wilton Ridge held an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited. I went anyway. The community center gymnasium was packed. Metal chairs clanged on the tile floor. Retirees, young couples, families with strollers, they all crammed in, their whispers buzzing like a hornet's nest. I sat in the back, boots muddy, field vest zipped up, a copy of the forged deed in my hand. When Deborah walked to the podium, the room hushed. She began her speech the way I'd expected. Community values, growth, investment, future planning. But she didn't get 3 sentences in before a man in the front row shouted, "You lied to us!" Another voice rose. "Did you really build on land you don't own?" The room rippled with anger, confusion, betrayal. I stood. I didn't shout. Didn't walk to the front. I just held up the deed. This, I said, voice carrying through the room, is a fake. Submitted by your leadership, signed with a forgery of my name. Used to take land that belonged to my family for 3 generations. This isn't progress. It's theft. Gasps, murmurs, the kind of sound a community makes when its illusion cracks. Tried to step forward with legal jargon. Someone shouted him down. Deborah gripped the podium so tight her knuckles turned white. Then a gray-bearded man in flannel stood in the front row. "I've lived here 20 years, he said. Built my porch with my own hands. I joined this HOA to keep our neighborhood clean, not to steal from folks." A woman clutching her daughter's hand stood next. Then a retired teacher. Then a couple who'd only moved in last year. Not all supported me, but none supported them anymore. The meeting dissolved into shouts, accusations, and chairs scraping against tile. I slipped out quietly before someone tried to throw me out. Back home, I sat on the porch with Lucky, looking out at the dark field. The stop work orders flapped in the wind like battle flags. The HOA had fired their shot. Now the community had seen the truth. And tomorrow, the rest of the world would too. The silence the next morning was almost unnerving. No engines, no hammering, no HOA volunteers pounding signs into the dirt. I stood on the porch with my coffee, Lucky at my feet, and listened to the wind ripple through the cottonwoods. After weeks of war, the quiet felt less like peace and more like the pause between storms. I didn't have to wait long. By 9 a.m., my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Coleman?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes." "This is Valerie Torres, Office of the Inspector General, Department of the Interior. We've received your documentation, as well as files from the Langston Zoning Board. We've also reviewed the footage of your property and the alleged development activity." "Alleged?" I asked, my voice flat. She hesitated. "I'm being polite. What we're seeing is deeply concerning. I'm dispatching a federal field investigator today. We want to begin an official review of all permits related to Wilton Ridge HOA and Southside Development Group." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me yet," she replied. "They're going to come after you harder now. Be ready." She was right. By noon, I got an email from a law firm in the state capital. One of those with a letterhead so sharp you can feel the billable hours just looking at it. The sender was Blake Maddox, attorney for Wilton Ridge HOA. The subject line read, "Cease and desist. Defamation." They were threatening to sue me for speaking the truth, for showing the world what they'd done. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. I forwarded it to Terry. 2 hours later, he responded with a PDF attachment and a one-line message. "Your counter just became federal." The attachment was a formal notice of pending federal investigation served to Wilton Ridge HOA Southside Development Group citing Title 43, CFR 1610.5-3B, unauthorized land use on federally classified parcels with a pending environmental review, under NEPA. For the first time since this started, I let myself feel something close to hope, until I heard the pounding at my door. This wasn't a knock, it was a bang. When I opened it, 2 uniformed men stood outside. Not private security this time. Langston County Sheriff's Office. "Mr. Coleman?" the taller one said. "Yes. We have a report of hostile threats made against HOA board members." I blinked. "What?" He tapped a tablet. "According to their sworn statements, you made verbal threats of violence during the board meeting Saturday night." I stared at him, reading his face, looking for the truth beneath the uniform. I stood up. I spoke the truth. I never threatened anyone. The shorter deputy frowned. "Do you mind if we come in and talk?" I stepped aside. Lucky sat in the corner, watching them with that same quiet suspicion I felt in my own bones. I played them the video of the meeting, which had been streamed live by a resident. It showed me standing in the back, calm and steady, holding the forged deed in one hand, speaking facts, not threats. It showed the room turning on Deborah and her board, voices rising, neighbors shouting, but not me. When the video ended, the taller deputy exhaled. "Looks like they're trying to bury you under paperwork. Looks." "Like," I said, "they left without incident, but not without warning." "They haven't even begun," the shorter one said quietly on his way out. By Tuesday, the federal investigator arrived, Her name was Maura Jensen, early 40s, sharp eyes, hiking boots instead of heels. She carried a satchel of printed maps and a badge that had the kind of weight you can feel in your ribs. She spent 2 hours walking the land with me. We moved through the field like doctors, examining a wounded patient. She crouched near the bulldozer scars, tracing the grooves with her fingers. She compared my survey maps to the HOA's fraudulent blueprints. She marked the spots where the heavy equipment had churned through soil that should never have been touched. "This is worse than I expected," she muttered. "What does that mean?" I asked. She pointed to a narrow trench near the old creek bed. "See that cut? That channel links to a watershed basin. They disrupted a federally monitored floodplain." I stared at the exposed soil, feeling both rage and grim satisfaction. "What does that mean for them?" "It means," she said, standing and brushing dirt off her hands, "this isn't just a land grab anymore. This is an environmental violation, which means the Army Corps of Engineers and the EPA are about to get involved." She gave me a small, knowing smile. "And that, Mr. Coleman, means big trouble for your neighbors." 2 days later, 3 men in olive drab jackets and baseball caps appeared at my gate. They carried clipboards and satellite printouts. One of them, a stoic man named Hank, whistled low when he saw the damage. "Looks like somebody's gonna need more than an apology," he said. They marked the construction zone with fluorescent tape, took soil samples, and launched an emergency review to halt all building activity on every parcel the HOA had touched. Then, the real hammer fell. That weekend, the State Environmental Agency declared a temporary development freeze on all Wilton Ridge HOA projects, pending investigation of fraud, environmental violations, land encroachment. The news hit the community like a bomb. I drove past the HOA office. The next morning, where there had once been shiny signs and manicured planters, there was now a federal notice taped across the glass. "Premises closed. Pending investigation. United States Department of the Interior." The small crowd that had gathered didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just stared, as if the building itself might confess. I parked across the street and stayed in my truck. Someone pointed at me. Few neighbors nodded, a few turned away. I didn't wave. The silence said everything. By now, local media had turned into a wildfire. The Langston Ledger ran a front-page story. HOA under federal probe, forged deeds and illegal construction. Alleged. Channel 4 aired Carla Nguyen's segment on Sunday morning, right after church hour. Clips of me standing in my pasture, badge in hand, aired between shots of abandoned bulldozers and scarred earth. The headline was simple. HOA tried to steal his land. He fought back. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something new settle in my chest. Not relief, not victory. Leverage. The HOA wasn't just fighting me anymore. They were fighting the truth. And the truth was winning. That night, I walked the perimeter of my land with Lucky trotting beside me. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods. The air smelled like damp earth and diesel ghosts. I paused at the trench where the bulldozer had first broken ground. The soil was jagged and raw, a scar that would take years to heal. "Almost there, boy," I whispered to Lucky. "Almost." The first thing I noticed was the soil. It wasn't just dirt to me. It was the pulse of this land. And that morning, when I knelt down and sank my hands into it, I could feel how angry it was. Dry where it should have been damp, crusted and cracked in places, silty in others. Months ago, this field had hummed under my boots, alive with rhythm and memory. Now it was confused. The heavy machinery had torn through it like the skin of something sacred, mixing layers that had taken decades to form. It wasn't just damaged, it was wounded. I whispered to no one in particular, "We'll fix you, I promise." By then, Wilton Ridge HOA was in freefall. The federal notice still hung across their office doors. Southside Development Group had pulled out entirely, blaming unforeseen regulatory hurdles, and local news had turned the HOA's name into a punchline. Some residents defended the board in whispers at the grocery store, saying I had overreacted. Others avoided my aisle altogether, as if standing too close to me might put them on camera. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was the man who exposed the HOA. And that came with its own kind of isolation. I buried myself in the land. I started by mapping every scar. Yellow flags for compacted zones. Red for chemical runoff. Blue for invasive sprouts where the soil had been stripped bare. I borrowed a small cultivator from my neighbor, Old Frank, and turned the earth slowly, gently, like unlearning a trauma. It felt less like farming and more like surgery. Every evening, I collapsed onto the porch, sore in every muscle, Lucky leaning against my leg as if to remind me I wasn't alone. 2 weeks later, a caravan of cars pulled up the drive. Not HOA, not law enforcement. Students. About a dozen of them, clipboards and drones in hand, led by Dr. Elena Bell from the local university's Environmental Science Department. She shook my hand firmly. "Mr. Coleman," she said, "your land is now a case study." They spent the weekend documenting everything. Core samples to track contamination, drone footage to map erosion measurements of water flow along the scarred creek line. It was technical and tedious, and oddly comforting. Finally, I wasn't just fighting, I was rebuilding. Sunday night, I sat on the porch with Dr. Bell as the sun dropped behind the hills, turning the field gold for the first time since all this began. "You know," she said, "this land will heal. It might take seasons, maybe years, but it'll heal." I nodded. "If they let it?" She smiled faintly. "Oh, I don't think anyone's going to try this again. Not after all this." I stared at the horizon, the cottonwoods swaying like they were whispering secrets. "They almost erased it," I said softly. "All that history, all that work, almost gone." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. "Sometimes," she said, "land remembers longer than people do, but it needs someone to speak for it first." Her words stayed with me long after the students left. By early spring, change arrived in a different form. A knock on the door, not sharp, not threatening this time. When I opened it, Sharon Rivera stood there, mid-50s, firm handshake, eyes like someone who'd seen enough to know better. "I'm running for HOA president," she said. "And if I win, I want you to advise us." I raised an eyebrow. "You want me on the board?" She shook her head. "No, I want you beside it. Someone who knows where the boundaries are and how to protect them." I hesitated, glancing out, over the field. The memory of banners and bulldozers still clung to the air. "I'll think about it," I said. Weeks passed. The abandoned construction materials were hauled away. The shiny "condos coming soon" sign disappeared. In its place, someone hammered a hand-painted plank into the earth at the end of my drive. "Respect the land. Respect each other." I didn't put it there, but I left it up. Because for the first time, it felt like the neighborhood was listening. Then, one crisp morning in early spring, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just a wax seal with a federal eagle pressed into it. Inside was a letter confirming that my land had been surveyed and reclassified as a protected agricultural heritage parcel under the Land Legacy Act. No future annexation, no rezoning, no HOA claim, no bulldozer would ever touch it again. I sat on the porch for a long while, the letter in my hands, Lucky's head resting on my boots. The field wasn't healed yet, but I could breathe. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of my land, letting my fingers graze the fence posts, feeling the wind move through the cottonwoods. The bulldozer scars were still visible, the ruts and trenches still raw in places, but tiny shoots of ryegrass had started to break through. Earthworms had returned to the topsoil, and for the first time in months, the land felt alive under my boots again. I stopped by the pecan sapling I'd planted in the heart of the field, right where the first machine had cut into the earth. Its young leaves rustled softly. "My mother would have loved this," I whispered. "She always said trees remember better than people." I stayed there a while, listening to the wind carry her voice back to me in pieces I could almost believe were real. By now, Wilton Ridge was unrecognizable. The old board had resigned or been voted out. The HOA's books were open for the first time in its history. And the new leadership, with Sharon at the helm, held listening sessions in the same gym where the first shouts had erupted. I went once, at Sharon's invitation. The room was quieter than I'd ever seen it. No hostility, no smugness, just neighbors. People who wanted to do better than the ones who came before. I didn't make speeches. I didn't hold up deeds. I just said one thing: we all live on borrowed land. The least we can do is leave it better than we found it. No applause, just nods. And for once, that was enough. The scars were still there, on the land and in me. But new growth had a way of writing its own story. By summer, wildflowers bloomed along the edges of the field. The ryegrass had taken hold, and on Saturday mornings, school buses rolled up the gravel drive, unloading students who wanted to learn from what the land had survived. I never thought I'd become a teacher, but standing out there in the sun, talking about soil layers and water flow, about boundaries and legacy, I realized something. This wasn't just my victory. It was a story the land would carry long after I was gone, and for the first time I felt the weight lift. The battle was over. The healing had begun. Some mornings I still wake before the sun, expecting to hear bulldozers. The memory of those engines lives in me like an old scar. But now, when I step out onto the porch with my coffee, all I hear is wind and birdsong. The land has gone quiet. Again. Not the tense, brittle quiet of waiting for war, but the soft, breathing quiet of peace. It's been a year since the last banner came down. The cottonwoods by the creek have grown a little taller. The pecan sapling I planted in the bulldozer's first scar now stretches above my head, leaves rustling like applause. Lucky still patrols the fence line every morning, as if he's the guardian of this new calm. Sometimes he stops to sniff the ground where the old tire ruts used to be, as if to confirm that the intruders are truly gone. They are. Wilton Ridge. HOA exists in name only now. A skeleton crew of volunteers led by Sharon Rivera focuses on lawn care, trash collection, and little else. The days of power trips and land grabs are over. Southside Development Group, bankrupt within 6 months of the federal investigation, and Deborah Marks? She left town under cover of night, her for sale sign appearing one morning and her house empty by the next. The story goes that she moved to Florida, chasing a new start. I didn't celebrate, because this wasn't about her. It never was. Thy land was the real story. After the investigation closed and the federal protections were locked in, I stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like a caretaker again. I planted cover crops where the topsoil had been ripped apart. I brought in truckloads of compost, slow and careful, working the land like you'd comfort a friend who's been hurt. I watched water return to the low spots, trickling through the creek bed again after spring rains, carrying life where it had been scraped bare. And then one morning, it happened. I was walking the field, checking the new ryegrass growth, when I spotted a single wildflower. Bright purple, delicate petals trembling in the breeze. I crouched down, the sun warm on my shoulders, and just stared at it. It wasn't much, but it was life, blooming where there had once been nothing but scars. I don't mind admitting I cried a little. That summer, the students returned. Dr. Elena Bell brought a new batch of environmental science majors, and they set up camp under the cottonwoods for a weekend. They took soil readings, drone footage, and water samples, but this time their faces weren't grave. They were smiling, laughing, passing around jars of earthworms they found wriggling back through the damp soil. This place bounced back faster than I thought it would, Dr. Bell said as we walked the perimeter. Land remembers, I said quietly. She nodded. Land forgives too, sometimes faster than people. I thought about that all night as I watched fireflies blink over the field. One morning in early fall, Sharon Rivera stopped by. She stood at the edge of my porch, hat in hand, and said, "Ben, the HOA voted to name this area on the community map." I raised an eyebrow. She smiled faintly. "They're calling it Coleman Field." I didn't know what to say. It wasn't about ego. It was about being seen, about knowing that for once a community had chosen to honor the land instead of erasing it. I nodded, my throat tight. "Thank you," I said simply. As the seasons turned, the farm became something more than my refuge. It became a story. Local schools brought kids to learn about soil health and conservation. Neighbors stopped by to help plant wildflowers along the fence line. Even a small documentary crew came out. One weekend, capturing drone footage of the land reborn, the story of the battle that almost wasn't told. I never watched the documentary. I didn't need to, because I live it every day. Sometimes, in the long, quiet hours of dusk, I think about my mother. I can almost hear her voice on the wind. "Don't let them pave it over, Ben." I didn't. Not because I was stronger than the HOA or louder or meaner, but because I remembered who I was. And I remembered that some fights aren't about winning. They're about refusing to surrender. One night, a storm rolled in from the west. Lightning flashed over the hills. Rain hammered the roof of the old barn, filling the air with the smell of wet earth. I stood at the edge of the porch with Lucky and watched the water flow into the creek bed, clear and steady, feeding the land that had survived everything thrown at it. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. I hadn't just saved the land. The land had saved me, too. It reminded me that legacy isn't a plaque or a deed. It's not a fence line or a badge. Legacy is the quiet knowledge that you left something standing when the world tried to take it away. The sun rose the next morning on a clean, rain-washed sky. Mist curled off the field, and the pecan sapling gleamed with droplets that caught the first light like diamonds. I walked out barefoot into the wet grass, felt the earth give under my steps, soft and forgiving. Lucky ran ahead, barking at a pair of deer grazing at the edge of the cottonwoods. I stopped in the center of the field and just listened. No bulldozers, no shouting, no fear, just the sound of land breathing again. And for the first time, I allowed myself to whisper the words I'd been holding back since the day this war began. "It's over. We're home."